this event is being recorded, and I feel obliged to say that if you do not want anything to be out there on the internet, don't say it, because the event will be put onto the Institute of African Studies website, which is just a wonderful resource for people who can't make it to the seminar. I know it's being used in other classes, and so on. So, you know, we're building up our public resources. So the topic for the discussion today is the place of, not just the place of childhood, but the meanings of childhood in African diasporic literature. And our author is Christopher Ouma, who is a senior lecturer. These categories that are South African categories, senior lecturer in literature at the University of Cape Town, but he is currently speaking to us from Cambridge, where he's hanging out at Harvard for a couple of months. So this is Christopher's first book, but he has published widely in addition to this in literature journals. And I think Chris's new work is beginning to take up issues of publishing, right, in East Africa, Chris. There is some interest in our institute too in that theme, and Chambi Chachage is here. He's going to be I think on a panel dealing with that issue. So welcome, Chris, to Canada, to the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And we look forward to hearing your discussion of what you wanted to achieve with this book. In conversation with Chris today are Sarah Duff, who is Assistant Professor of History at Colby College in Maine, also a historian of childhood, so really an apt person to speak about this. Sarah's book is on childhood in the Cape Colony, and is very much interested in questions of place, memory, race, and gender. Her new work is on sex education in the colonies, so for children, sex education for children. So Sarah, you're such a great person to have speak to us about this book. And then last but not least, our colleague in the Institute of African Studies, Nduka Otiono, who is a professor of literature, a journalist, a much published and celebrated poet, and in addition to his volumes of poetry, his most recent book is on polyvocality and Bob Dylan. So his range is broad, and his insights are really fabulous for those of us thinking about culture and literature coming from Africa. So welcome to all three of you. We'll open it up after their discussion to your questions, so keep them ready and let me know by means of raising your hand. So Chris Ouma, go ahead, tell us about this book. But before we do that, can I just say that for all that it's written so beautifully, this is the most unhelpful and wordy title. I couldn't believe it. So tell us why you had to put everything into this title.
Should I start there, or should I start?
I'm teasing you because it's such a readable book. It's so readable.
Thank you. Okay, so just a quick question. I am now in the Department of English and African Studies. I now hold a joint appointment at UCT as an associate professor in that regard. I thought maybe I should start by giving you a sense of how the book came about, because I think that sort of background story is important, and perhaps it will give you a sense of what the book meant to me. And I don't know if I'll take the 20 minutes, or I'll probably be shorter, but I hope that I'm hoping for more conversation if people have read sections of the book, or or the entire book. I'm hoping to get more time to engage with that. But I suppose the genesis of this book started when I was, an undergraduate student. I was finishing my honors back in Kenya at Moi University, and I had one of my professors who was traveling abroad came back with a copy of Chimamanda Adichie's Papal Hibiscus. And we were doing a course on the contemporary African novel. And I was so blown away by the narrative and the story. I read it in one night. I just sat in my dorm room and I just read and read for hours until 5, 6 in the morning. By the time I was done, my eyes were so, they were tearing up. I was so tired, but I was really excited about what that would mean for my interest in that area. At the time, obviously, I didn't know that, I would pursue graduate studies entirely in that area. But one of the things I want you to understand is that I was brought up in a diet of a very sort of broad African sort of literary imagination and those of the diasporas. And I was sort of brought up in a sort of a diet that gave me a sense of East, West, South, and literatures of the Black diaspora, so the Caribbean, North America. And these were sort of early generation writers. In the case of modern African literature, there was a clear sense that there were people who were sort of the vanguard generation in the late 50s and early 60s at that moment of transition, into postcolonial modernity, into the period of decolonization. And that the beginning of modern African literature was also sort of linked to the state and the project of nationalism, so national identities in that regard, and building of institutions around that, whether they are the African Writer series, which was one of the most famous, most well-read and most traveled series of African writing in the world, with Chinua Achebe being the sort of poster child for that. Or the setting up of English departments that then became literature departments in many parts of the continent. Those of us who studied in East and West Africa will recognize the struggles of people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o in the late 60s to begin to shift institutional logics around imagination and literature within university spaces. And of course, the most famous of those was the 1968 letter that Ngugi and his colleagues wrote to the HOD of the English department at the time to change the department from English to the Department of Literature. And so that was a sort of first generation moment of modern African literature. That obviously doesn't preclude the fact that Africans were writing before that. It simply marks a moment that broadened the institutionalization of African literature and began to signal that African literature was going to be not just a discipline, but it was going to chart some sort of path around national identity, post-colonial modernity, and the process of decolonization. Those of us from South Africa would know, you had Sol Plaatje, you had other people who were writing in the early 20th century. So it doesn't in any way mark that moment as the beginning of African literature. And then of course you had the period of disillusionment that was marked by Ike Eyamar's novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, as a moment that was grappling with the beginnings of the failure of the national project, national imagination, in some ways the coherence of that project, and the beginning of other kinds of platforms besides and below these normative identity categories, right? And of course, the coming to reckon with the legacies of colonialism in the making of these post-colonial identities. And that period of disillusionment is the one that I'm arguing in this book sort of is a foundation of many of the writers here. And they would have grown up in the 70s and the 80s, and they would have encountered institutions that were fraying, that were no longer working, and identities that were already out of joint from the previous coherence of the first generation of writers. And so when I read Chimamanda's Papal Hibiscus, I was reckoning with that moment. I began to realize that, in fact, she had grown up like many of us at that moment. And it was exciting to see that moment being documented and registered. And it was, in my opinion, I think, creating a new dispensation, a new zeitgeist, so to speak, of where modern African literature was going to go. And so after reading that, I came across, obviously later, a whole slew of other writers who were beginning to publish in the late 90s, early 2000s. You know, your Chris Abanis, your Helen Oyemis, and some of the ones that I've mentioned in the book and selected for the book. And these were, the interesting thing about all of these writers is that they had, or most of them, that they had either grown up in the continent during that period and decided to leave for different reasons. Some of them would have left to study. Some of them would have left out of political reasons, to exile. Someone like Abani left to out of, you know, moments of political unrest and instability. And so there were a whole range of reasons. But what was clear as I continued to read most of those writers was that they had grown up in the continent and then left, and they were sort of building their lives elsewhere. And they constantly returned to the moment of their growing the continent to reckon with what they had to deal with, either the hyphenated identities of the diaspora, whether you're Nigerian American or you are sort of Black British, but you are also Nigerian or Kenyan. And so you have to sort of grapple with the intersections and the reproductions of identities that run across ethnicity, the nation, and diaspora. And so these are sort of three planks of identities that are at play. And in those different narratives that I look at, many of these writers return to childhood, as I argue in the book, as a set of ideas to navigate moving across these moments or these experiences of identity, and trying to not necessarily resolve, but to document the complexities of that, and perhaps chart a way for what's going to happen to these identities as we move into the new millennium. So the book, in a broad sense, pivots childhood as a framework that is quite influential in not just categorizing, but in creating critical tools for understanding this moment. It doesn't in any way argue that childhood is the only framework that does that. Of course, this is a select group of writers who are trying to do that, but it also allows us to hark back to earlier moments where, in one of the chapters, for instance, in chapter 5, chapter 4, where I revisit the child soldier as a figure that is tropological to the formation of modern African literature, and how so childhood then becomes this paradigm within that genealogy. And so that's one dimension. And so there are other dimensions in the book that speak to various facets of childhood identity. The Cold War, which is a major moment for many of these writers, 70s and 80s. Growing up, in the case of Binyavanga Wainaina and even Adichie, growing up in the case of Binyavanga, trying to engage with that Cold War moment, its political complexities, but to say that it's certainly more complicated than how the image of Africa has circulated around that time. And if you read that chapter, you'll see that there's a sort of how do I put this? There's a politics of class that these writers used to try and say, well, you know, there are class dynamics that tell a different story of that moment. It was not just a moment that was binarized. It was a moment that allowed, because of certain class dynamics, for time to slow down, for it to be complicated in the way that I'm reading Binyavanga's One Day I'll Write About This Place, and to return to the ordinary. How does one return to the ordinary outside of the spectacle of Africa as this continent ridden with disease and with the stereotypes that we all know the world often likes to peddle. And so it's a chapter that marks the Cold War as a production of a certain kind of childhood, and therefore a certain kind of reading time and identity in contemporary African literature. And then, of course, the third chapter goes back to memory, the question of memory, and it pivots how an event like Biafra has also contributed to how certain subgenres of modern African literature play out in the 80s and 90s, and particularly the Biafran novel. And those of us in the audience would know that there's a long tradition of that. But then the question is, how does one remember Biafra, not just in the context of Nigeria in the late 60s and early 70s, but in the broader context of the politics of the Cold War and that moment of decolonization, and how that became a foundational moment for us thinking about other sites of postcolonial war in Francophone Africa, all the way up to Sudan and Rwanda in 1994. So Biafra becomes this moment that allows us a different take on memory through the return of childhood in thinking about these memories. And in some ways, how does one register that moment, its complexities, to reflect on the way, say, Igbo novelists who are in the diaspora have a relationship with Nigerianness? How do they have a relationship with the continent? And how does that allow us to make claims about the concept of the nation state in this millennial moment in relation to these identities? And in that chapter, I think there are key theoretical planks around studies on post-memory, but also Michael Rothbard's multidirectional memory that builds on sort of the stuff that was done with Holocaust studies, but trying to push those ideas to reckon with Biafra, because Biafra, even though it happens immediately after the Holocaust, it's not as the sort of formality of understanding it is not there, and for reasons that are quite national, that are very specific to Nigeria. But whenever you speak to, and I spoke to my parents, they'll tell you how images of Biafran children were circulating around the world, how it created this global imagination of Africa, and it shaped the way Africa was thought about as this continent of childhood in very significant ways. And in some ways, I think the Biafran government was able to capitalize on that through their own propaganda. But that moment had its own politics that spoke to there's a political theorist at Chicago who's recently written a book called I don't know if anybody remembers, Adam Getachew, who's written a book on world making and how there's a hierarchy within the international order around which states in the world are more superior to others, which states are dominant in the imagination of political equality around the world. And that moment was registering that you could have had the Holocaust, and you could have had the Holocaust generating so much of how the world rethought itself in terms of the crisis of memory, making us return to the connections between fascism and colonialism, and how the world is connected through that event. And yet an event like Biafra really is resigned to footnotes, partly because of this broader politics. Who is more important to memorialize than the other? Which states have a stake in making their own traumatic moments, which are in fact significant in asking difficult questions around the legacies of colonialism and map making. Who determines whether that political process as it's playing out has lessons for the world? And of course, I think it's chapter four. I think it's the same chapter where I look at Adichie's Hafuvelo-san and how Hafuvelo-san, while it's a very specific project about building Adichie's family monument, it's also drawing comparatively on the Holocaust, on Rwanda, within the text itself. It's drawing on those memories as these different characters grapple with their own trauma and how to remember it. So it's an interesting text in that sense, in the way that it internationalizes and draws a comparative logic with Biafra. And of course, what is at stake is how do these children of Biafra, these children who grew up at that time or grew up immediately after, how do they remember this event to be able to comment on what it means for these broader identity categories, the nation and the diaspora in this millennial moment? How does that help them justify that there was always an outer-national, extra-national identity, even in that moment that we have to keep sight of? And how do childhoods and the experiences allow them to articulate that? And then, of course, the other dimension of queer childhoods is also important because it addresses something that has become really prominent in the last 5 to 10 years in the continent, and yet, I mean, I'm sure we are aware of the broader debates around queer identity in the continent, and what I'm trying to argue in the chapter is that contemporary African writers of sort of this diasporic mold have brought this issue to the table, and they've brought it into national and continental imagination in very significant ways. They are one of the first generations to bring it into popular imagination and public discourse. And I'm using the example of Abani's novels to demonstrate that. And I try to place those novels in the context and in the company of a range of other narratives that have been published in the last 5 to 10 years. So in other words, and how do we rethink the heteronormativity of this enterprise of modern African literature? How does this generation allow us to ask those difficult questions? Even though we know first and second generation writers have grappled with it in certain moments, and I know that there have been rereadings of first generation narratives around questions of sexuality, but these contemporary writers have really brought it to public imagination and public discourse. I don't really grapple with Binyavanga, but one of the things he does in his memoir, One Day I Write About This Place, is that he pulls out that chapter that he uses to come out with a couple of years later, which is a fascinating thing to do. So when One Day I Write About This Place was published, I think it's fascinating to think how the sort of sleight of hand that he does with that memoir, because when it was published, it became almost immediately canonized, and it was taught in different parts of the continent, and then the missing chapter came out. Of course, the memoir itself was closeted. When the missing chapter came out, in which he comes out, it generated this
letter to his mother. This is in the letter to his mother, yes.
Yes, and it's a chapter that he pulls out. He pulls out of the memoir. It becomes interesting how that particular chapter is going to figure in these discussions that have already been going on about the memoir in the continent. And so it's a really fascinating moment where one plays with time and genre and, to sort of complicate these discussions. So contemporary African writers really have brought that. And I think that the perspective of childhood, as I argue in the book, has been central to articulating that. And then, of course, the overarching question of migration and the diaspora is the subject of the last chapter, which tries to articulate the sort of complex dynamics around what I started saying earlier. How does one talk about ethnicity and the nation within that space of the diaspora? How does one see how it's complicating how we are going to conceptualize and theorize this concept called diaspora? And what I'm arguing in the chapter is that contemporary African writers, by the volume of work they're producing, where they're located, are beginning to really affect the way we think about the concept of diaspora. Obviously, they're putting a lot more meat into a demographic of Africans who Adichie's, Americana is an interesting example in that regard, in the way that it teases out those tensions between American Blacks and non-American Blacks, which I find, in my opinion, I find ungenerative, because of course there's a lot of political work that was happening in the 60s and 70s that makes connections between contemporary experiences of being in the diaspora and those of the Middle Passage. But this sort of cohort of contemporary African writers really mine down those sort of complicated differences between Middle Passage Blackness and the different kinds of Blacknesses that accrue over political time within sort of Black life around the world, whether it is the diasporas of the colonial moment in the early 20th century, or those of the moment of decolonization, or those of that moment of disillusionment in which these writers belong to. How do you categorize these, and how do you then rethink how we use diaspora as a concept? So that chapter does that sort of work, And I think Helen Oyemi is interesting in that regard because she's in the UK, she's in England, and her narratives are sort of always playing around with comparative diasporas. She brings really, really fascinating logic of comparative diasporas in the sense of either narratives about Afro-Cubans in London in relation to Nigerian British or Black British, and these sort of kinds of Blackness that attend to those geographies that allow us to genealogize, to historicize, to articulate a more complex sense of Blackness in that regard. So I think those are the dimensions that are very clearly, I hope, articulated in the book. And yeah, I don't know what else to add, other than say that I hope that the book brings out childhood as not just a theme, but it's generating a whole range of things. It's generating an aesthetic in contemporary African lit. It's generating a framework of understanding this moment. It's registering the zeitgeist of this moment in very significant ways. And it is also complicating our understanding of childhood, of Africa as a land of childhood, as a stereotype. And I in the book, I don't play on that. In fact, I move on from that at the beginning very quickly to say that this is not just a theme. While we have a continent that statistically and demographically is made up of over 50% of people who are classified as children, and while there have been all of these moments of political unrest, it's certainly more complicated than that. And the kind of take that Chinua Achebe and them, were the first generation, would have thought about Africa in relation to those images of childhood is slightly different from what these contemporary writers are putting on the table. So I think I'll stop there, and I hope that was
yeah. I
5
mean,
or 10.
I think that comes across very, very well in the book, that the ways in which you're thinking about childhood far exceed anything else that has been written. And I mean, I think, you know, just to flag that at some point I'd really also like you to talk about the way in which you connect disillusionment in childhood and futures past. It's a wonderful concept of futures past. But maybe we can return to that in the discussion. So thank you very much, Chris. Sarah, I'll hand to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Chris. Thank you so much for inviting me to respond to this really amazing book. I'm really excited for this discussion. Also, I wanted to say thank you, Shireen and Femi, for organizing this really wonderful seminar series. It's been a highlight of my Wednesdays this semester, so thanks very, very much for that. I've written out my comments so that I make productive use of my 10 minutes and don't go over time. So I'm just going to read what I was thinking about, and I think it picks up on some of the things that Chris was saying now. So my questions and comments are informed by my work as an historian of childhood and of age in Africa, and more specifically by a book I've been completing, which surveys the scholarship on histories of childhood and youth on the continent. I'm writing it for Palgrave as a kind of survey text that will be useful for students. As I've remarked to Chris before, this book made me rethink entirely, and in totally a good way, my approach to the field. In Childhood and Contemporary Diasporic African Literature, Memories and Futures Past, Chris Ouma asks us why so much of contemporary African literature, written by a third generation of post-colonial African writers, both on and beyond the continent, features child protagonists. He suggests, persuasively in my view, that childhood is, quote, a set of ideas foregrounded to grapple with contemporary forms of identity that arise from an embodied pluri-dimensional continental and diasporic experience. These experiences are mediated through the temporal telescope, if we can call it, of the latter half of the 20th century, but which I argue here as moments of contemporary authorial possibility. Put another way, childhood offers a time, an identity, a space, especially of the everyday, in which to question national and diasporic narratives, to interrogate heteronormativity, and to explore the complicated relationship between memory and trauma, and the intergenerational transmission of the latter. So I have two broad sets of questions, and these are very historian of childhood questions, I apologize, but these are things that I'm interested in, and over the past few months, when I've been reading so much of the scholarship in childhood and youth in Africa, mainly by historians and anthropologists and some literary scholars and some political scientists. And I'm constantly struck by how bad we are talking to each other across kind of disciplinary silos. So this is my attempt as an historian to talk across this silo. So I hope that it's useful. So I have two broad sets of questions, and specifically about the book's use of childhood and of generation, two terms which come loaded with meaning. So firstly, as to childhood. As an historian of age, I'm particularly attentive both to the social construction of age I'm particularly attentive to the social construction of age categories. Childhood, as we define it presently crystallized at about the turn of the 19th century as Enlightenment, Romantic, and Christian evangelical ideas came together to produce the powerful notion that childhood should be a time of innocence. This occurred at the same time that middle-class family life in industrialized states changed too, with the domestic space increasingly understood as a sanctified haven overseen by women and organized to the benefit of children whose whole value existed in their status as children. This distinctly white and middle-class experience of childhood was extrapolated in the 19th century to be what innocent childhood was. Any other kind of childhood was held up as lacking, even abusive. This profound shift had all sorts of positive consequences: the regulation of children's labor, the extension of universal education, the criminalization of child abuse. But it also took place in the context of colonial conquest, and so was shaped by 19th century imperialism. As Chris makes the point, Africans have indeed long been infantilized by abolitionists holding up childlike Africans in need of saving by Western missionaries and humanitarians, by proponents of colonial conquest who characterized Africans as childish, as irrational, gullible, wildly emotional, by the League of Nations mandate system, which deemed African colonies to be in need of maturation before independence. But this ideology of childhood has material consequences for children on the continent during colonial conquest and under colonial rule. While some scholars have suggested that pre-colonial institutions of age were simply erased under colonial rule, I would argue that they were overlaid with new and changing ideas about childhood, which changed in the colonial encounter, as innocence, for instance, was racialized. While Chris does touch on this history of contemporary ideas of what constitutes childhood in his book, the book doesn't, to me, engage with it to any great extent, and I'm interested in why that is. So I have two questions. The first, Icarus Girl, fantastic novel, does invoke the pre-colonial understanding of Yoruba childhood and its cosmology, but generally these authors do not seem to pay much attention to what constitutes childhood, or a question which really preoccupies historians: who gets to be a child? Although perhaps Adichie does this in Half of the Yellow Sun. If childhood is a set of ideas which allows scholars to interrogate and explore a range of big questions, why does it not interrogate itself? A concept which is associated profoundly with Western modernity. Why not pay closer attention to what we really mean by childhood in this book? And why do these authors seem to be less interested in this question? Secondly, and related to this point, it seems to me that other categories of identity, and you did actually gesture to this now in your presentation, could do this similar kinds of work of being a space to hold together a set of ideas, and I think particularly of queer identities. How does childhood function differently? In asking these questions, I think especially of an intervention made by historian Ishita Pandey in a recent forum on the history of childhood in the American Historical Review. And she writes, "What makes children worthy of historical scrutiny is not the fact that we all inhabited something called childhood in the past, but that some were and are considered incapable of outgrowing childhood. What makes children a powerful tool of critique and analysis is that there is also a politics to refusing to leave it behind." In other words, contemporary definitions of childhood come with a set of politics, allowing some to be children, others not to be children, some never to leave it, others never to want to leave it. What happens when we write about childhood without considering that historical baggage or that kind of politics? So my second set of questions relates to the concept of generation, which has been a preoccupation of historians and anthropologists of Africa for some time. Age was a primary vector of power in pre-colonial African societies, alongside especially gender, free or unfree status, for instance, and other factors, and which varied across time and space. Historian Paul Okerbach, for instance, has argued that age, rather than ethnicity, for example, was by far the most important consideration in the apportioning of power in the societies who lived in the region which we now call Kenya in the pre-colonial period. I think other scholars might suggest the same for other parts of the continent. Understanding that childhood existed as a stage in a much bigger age system, a phase which was necessarily transient and whose conclusion would be marked by rituals in most societies, helps us to think about adulthood too as an age category with attendant expectations for behaviors, obligations, rights, and so on. I have then two questions. Firstly, how does age function in these novels? Secondly, and more specifically, you draw a distinction between these novels and the more conventional Bildungsroman, where the end of childhood, whether mourned or celebrated, is usually described as a moment of realization, of coming into full knowledge, or of becoming self-conscious. These novels resist the linearity of the Bildungsroman in favor of bigger, messier questions and explorations. But in choosing child protagonists, these texts all signal precisely the temporary state of this phase of development. Is adulthood then a foreclosure of the possibilities represented by childhood, or is it something else? So I've got other questions too, but I'll leave it at that.
Lovely and provocative. Thank you, Sarah. Christopher, I'll come back to you after Nduka. Hold on to your answers.
Do you mind if
yeah? Do you want to say something now?
I'm just worried I might forget some of the. It's a very sort of robust response, and I just wanted to make a couple of comments before, but it's fine. I can wait for Nduka.
Well, let's have Nduka, and then we'll remind you if you forget them. Nduka.
Thank you very much, Shireen. And then, Chris, I thought that it was a good idea to wait so that some of the points I might make might interlace, and then you can take them together. Thank you so much, Shireen, for organizing this series. It's been wonderful. Just like Sarah had said, it is like a monthly conference, as it were, and under COVID and the pandemic, one that we look forward to, that provides opportunity to enter into conversations and also to see faces and new faces at that, which you have facilitated. And of course, Femi, this looks like one end that shouldn't end, in terms of this series, but I'm sure we'll have another cycle. I think that I've been fortunate to be invited to interlocute on this particular book. I must confess that I hadn't paid attention to it. That's Chris's book until Shireen slated me and had a conversation with me, and I got the book. And reading it has been very revealing. I think it's like Shireen had said early on, Chris, I think it's very well written. And you attempt something that is not easy to do, which is taking multiple novels by very different writers with different temperament, different attitudes to childhood, and then, articulating this in a very coherent way. So I have found this book quite illuminating, more so because it comes at a time when it would appear that discourses on childhood in African novels, especially with the overwrought idea of the child soldier, appear to have become a cliche. And here we are, with your capacity to take this and then reinvent it, and to draw our attention to some of these other details, as you'd say, it's more like reading back to something that we thought we had seen a great deal of. So what I'm going to do is to make the best use of my time, and in order to be able to ask some questions that I think I really want to ask, and to provoke conversations, which I am taking the author up in his earlier invitation, that he would prefer for this to be conversational. I'm just going to make a very I want to make the questions. So, and I'll be happy to repeat them. So while the two things I want to do, the post-independence writers and the 70s to 80s children and writers experienced crisis of nationhood that culminated in a massive brain drain from Africa to the West. This has led to writings by the generation of new African diaspora writers, new African diaspora writers that Christopher Ouma focuses on in this important book. The migration term produced what Ouma describes as the project of identity to shift from nations to individuals, who invariably felt their identity overdetermined by the experience of the crisis of nationhood, end of quote. And that's from page 2. This shift underscores the generational focus of African writing, and not just in this book, but like a recurrent trope in the criticism or discourse of African writing. From the post-independent generation to the writings by their successors, many of whom now live in the West. Well, that needs to be qualified, at least in terms of those that this book focused on, which is diasporic African literature. They live in the West, because a great deal more logically live in the homeland. On childhood, I'd like to read this key passage, but I'm just going to skip it, but I'll just point attention to it. It's on page 7, and I think it's the second paragraph on page 7, which for emphasis, underscores Ouma's approach to the childhood in these works. One point that I really find very fascinating in this, and I thought I should call attention to, is the idea of texts as commodities in a global system of capital. And here, Ouma states that these studies compel us to reflect on texts as commodities in a global system of capital. Contemporary African writers self-consciously take strategic interstitial positions between the global and local, between and amongst various forms and modes of address. Sometimes these multiple positionalities are riddled with paradoxes, such as Adichie's recent remarks about postcolonial theory, or such definitions as Afropolitan from Taye Selassie, which belie the economies of value and undermine moments of authorial and identity positionality. And this is from page 11 to 12. I'm intrigued by Ouma's fascinating overview of the historiography of childhood in African literature, which in itself could suffice as the focus of the book, especially for professors like me interested in texts that offer compelling survey of contemporary African literature concentrating on this topic. So my my English studies class, English 29-26, African Literatures 1, for example, have had to deal with this, and I found it fascinating that students, were engaged in it when we studied as a short take, to Chimamanda's dealing with this topic in her short story, Half of a Yellow Sun, which is not very popular, and then which I published in our anthology of contemporary Nigerian literature entitled Camouflage. To use the term that Ouma uses, the children of the post-colony, resonates with me as I recall the reactions of some writers of my generation from Nigeria to the celebrated poet Ni Osundare's qualification of generation as a CNN generation. To that, the poet Ogago Ifowodo used the term the stillborn generation to describe the generation, and attempt to describe the post-IMF and military dictatorship experience of the successors to Soyinka's so-called the wasted generation. And this is already evident, the issue of generation is very contestable and controversial. And I think Ouma addresses this in the concluding part of this study. Having provided this and then I'd like to know how, and these are the two main streams of my questions, are this. I'd like to know how you see the generational burden experienced by the writers you focus on. And these are Chris Obani, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Helen Oyemi, and Biavanga Wainana. Whether in the homeland or in the diaspora, as Novale Bulawayo explores in her novel, We Need New Names. And I think you highlight this also in the last chapter. And you do state, Ouma states that writing from the diaspora creates, and I quote, a spatial temporal rupture, orienting contemporary African writers to look back through the time of childhood to reconcile their post-national identities. So the two questions that I have, and they are related in a way, are these. I'd like you to explain further how and why you deployed Reinhard Koselleck's concept of futures past, a troubling oxymoron that seems to suggest that our memories are trapped in some kind of time warp, where the future begets the past, a paradox of Africa's struggles with development. And I'm particularly intrigued in how you explore this on page 190 of the book. I could read it later if anyone who hasn't read it wants to have a closer look at it, or you might as well, in your response, provide more insight into that. And then now, this is even the more that I'm very much interested in. And as I say here, I'll wear my hat as a letter writer for the critics to echo the Nigerian poet J.P. Clark on his role as a writer for his people. In other words, I am seizing this opportunity of this platform with you to highlight a critique by some reviewers of the book and to ask on behalf of the critics And all of those readers who might also have this at the back of their mind and would want to use any given opportunity to ask this question. And so I'm going to highlight this by calling critique 1 and critique 2, and I'll just read the points that they make, because I think this is a central critique of this book and one that this platform offers the author an opportunity to tackle or to explain. So critique 1, thinks that there's an omission. How does the trope of childhood in contemporary African literature feed or fight the Western tendency to infantilize the African continent? And then critique 2, and this is a related remark as well, things that it appears to repeat that childhood in contemporary diasporic African literature, memories and features past, that's this book, appears, and I quote the critique 2, appears to repeat a troubling binary. Childhood equals Africa, diaspora equals the West, which doesn't open the discourse on contemporary African imagination as radically as the author would have us believe. We are still left with the idea of Africa as a place of childhood or plurality, and the diaspora as a place of adulthood maturity. So this is a kind of binary, or adult imaginative recuperation of battered childhood. One is also quick to observe that Ouma's theory of childhood appears to validate a ubiquitous idea of Africa as a site of precarious childhood, a place of traumatic horror, where the contemporary diasporic African writer returns for morbid inspiration. What are these imaginative returns to traumatic childhoods indicative of? The diasporic African writer's search for meaning, healing, or inspiration, and we are supposed to gain from an understanding of contemporary African literature as a literature of traumatic childhoods. And I would like to know how you respond to this central critique. And by so doing, I think I would have provided the opportunity of those who are not here to listen to this question that they have had, and which I also had read the book. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nduka. There you go, Christopher. You've got some really interesting questions to answer. So I'll hand it to you first, and then we'll open it up to others.
I'm hoping that, we can have more discussion on many of these questions, because I don't know if I'll have enough time to respond to them. But I'll start with Nduka's the critique about the binaries, the perceived binaries of the book. I think that critique is important. I think, but one of the things that I think that critique misses is that the fact that the book is actually asking much more bigger questions around how does one engage with national identity. And I think that the complicated spaces of argument in the book are found in between the narratives around the continent and the diaspora in relation to national identity, either Kenyan American or Nigerian American, or in the case of Binyavanga Inaina, someone who grew up in East Africa with these multiple identities, Kinyarwanda, Kikuyu, who was sort of Ugandan, Rwandese, and Kenyan at the same time, and trying to grapple with that, and the space of childhood giving him that opportunity, because it's a space of childhood where these identities are sort of socialized. So I don't think that the book, in my opinion, maybe that's an effect that some people find, and I take seriously. I don't think that the point was to calcify those binaries. I think the point was to deploy childhood as something that is actually troubling those binaries. And in fact, I think the book does, in my opinion, stakes a claim that many of these writers straddle all of those spaces, right? I think the book is also trying to argue that they straddle all of those spaces, as opposed to a second or first generation of African writers. The concept of the Bintu that we know from the works of Buchi Emecheta, and those are always that it's out there, you come back here. There's a sort of binary logic that attended to how people understood those identities in the 50s and 60s. So I think that by claiming that childhood is a site of imaginative return, I don't think that I don't think that I'm reading it as a sort of morbid projections of what these writers wish their identities would be. I mean, if you think of Adichie's or the Biafra novel in this contemporary moment, I mean, these people are dealing with real moments of understanding how the memory of traumatic events that affected their families, how that affects their own identities out there. I mean, these are things that are real, and I think those texts offer they often chart really complicated ways of understanding those traumatic memories within the different class and gender and sort of racial politics that they occupy. So I don't really see that binary, and I suppose often when we talk about childhood, that's usually the first thing that comes to mind. And I think sometimes I think our sense of how we understand Africa has been overdetermined by that, and so we read for that. I think in the beginning of my book, in the introduction, I try to complicate that, to say that despite the presence of child soldiers, despite the kinds of traumatic histories, that there are other more complex dimensions of African identity. I think there are chapters in the book, like the one on the everyday, which complicates this notion that childhood, that Africa is this sort of spectacle of political instability, that these writers go back to their childhood and they slow down that time to be able to make us see people living and loving, and this children really understanding that they live in a very complicated world, and that they have something important to say about the kinds of identities that are being sort of foisted down on them. So I think that there are chapters there that grapple with, I think for someone like Binyavanga, the question of class is important. I think Binyavanga's narrative complicates this notion that Africa exists in those binaries. And the whole point of the chapter is to say that both Binyavanga and Adichie are pushing back. I think the danger of a single story, which I sort of invoke in that chapter, is trying to say, well, if we go back to those narratives of childhood, we begin to complicate this notion that Africa is a country, and that there's a single story of Africa that has to circulate. So I just wanted to push back on that. And the question of Reinhard Koselleck was generative for me, because when you go back to thinking about childhood, you're going back to engage with the question of time. And the different narratives of childhood that the book is engaging with do not necessarily only have child protagonists. They also have memories of childhood. So what I'm trying to do when I say it's a set of ideas is that you have memories and figures of images that allow us to talk about time in more complicated ways. Because child protagonists are part of this spectrum of childhood. So when I talk about it as a set of ideas, I find Reinhard Koselleck's notion of the future's past really generative in that regard. That how can you think of a generation of writers in this contemporary moment who are thinking about their childhood as as their adulthood, as the future of what that moment of childhood was about in the 70s. That they are, in fact, the future of what people like Achebe and Ngugi were trying to project. How do they grapple with that fact? I don't know if that makes sense. And so what is the difference between, and this is what Reinhard Koselleck says, what's the difference between experience and expectation? How does one diminish to make visible the other? And I think that it really gives me in the book a very complicated tool and framework for thinking about time and childhood. So I find it really generative. And I think it speaks to the question of generation as an analytic in the book. In the case of Adichie, for instance, how do you return to Biafra? To register Biafra as a traumatic moment for not just your grandparents, because her grandparents passed away. They, her grandfather on the mother's side and father's side, each of them passed away. How do you register those moments? Partly because, how do you register those moments in a way that is ethical enough and you do justice to it? Because of course you grew up not just with those stories, but you grew up where you saw people who had lost their limbs, who had, within the family. How do you create a monument of that moment in relation to your family without diminishing the fact that that trauma can pass across different generations in different ways? I don't know if that makes sense. So I hope that speaks to Koselleck, it speaks to the question of generation, and hopefully it speaks to Sarah's question around why generation is important as an analytic in the text. Beyond that, of course, we're talking about whenever you invoke the word contemporary, you're trying to classify, and you've got to bring in these terms, appropriate them in a way that they speak to what you mean by contemporary. So I suppose in answer to your question, Sarah, I would say that it's an analytic, and it doesn't necessarily categorize, but it does indicate a sort of dominant logic within this group of writers, within the cohort of writers in this millennial moment. Nduka, I like when you started by saying that there's a generation focus of African writing because of the crisis of national identity. And part of what I do in the introduction is to draw attention to how this genealogy is developed, that you have the first generation of modern African writers were invested in national identity, national literature, were invested in this project and the formality of it. And then you have that moment of disillusionment, and you have these writers who I'm writing about, who grew up in that moment, who don't have that coherent narrative already as children. They don't have this narrative that you get born and you go to this school and you'll grow up and you go and work in the civil service, and you will go to the, you go to the university, work in the civil service, and you will stay here. That narrative is gone. So it becomes a sort of it really brings down the individual as the how do I put this? The individual becomes it becomes central. The individual becomes central to how one will understand this moment and how it's beginning to shift how we think about Africa. So I like that point because it addresses how the question of generation becomes this sort of anxiety, becomes an anxiety. I think it's Harold Bloom who spoke about the anxiety of influence. And you see that in the case of Adichie's Papillary Discus, where she starts her novel with things started to fall apart when this and that. And it's an anxiety, partly because, well, there's a second and first generation of African writers. The nation state, nationalism as identity doesn't make coherent sense. But yet it's important, right? It's important for a certain cohort of writers across the Atlantics to say, well, we are Black British, we are Black in America, but we also have these national identities that we can't just sweep away. We can't sweep under the carpet. So we have to find ways of plugging in very multiple ways. And if you read the corpus of work of say, Helen Oyemi, The Icarus Girl is a really interesting novel in the sense that it's Black British and Nigerian. It's sort of I don't know, how do I put this? It's an immediate focus on the contemporary diasporic experience of migration in London. It's an immediate focus on that. And you've got this half mixed race child whose mother is Nigerian and whose father is English, who's haunted by her Blackness in this sort of space of racialization in England, but cannot find a middle passage sort of historical handle to be able to understand why she's seen as different, right? And then you move on to her second text, The Opposite House, which takes us historically further back to say that there's another handle, that being Black in London has multiple points of reference. You could be a mixed race Nigerian British child, but there are Afro-Cubans in that city who are also re-diasporizing themselves because, of course, Cuba has its own sort of historical moment with the Middle Passage. And then you have Nigerian, you have like Black British people, Black people who have Nigerian descent who have an immediate connection with the continent in the same city. So I think the whole point is to say that that there are these multiple points of reference that that these writers are trying to create in understanding where does one walk that sweet line, that sweet spot between ethnicity, the nation, and diaspora. How does one walk that tightrope? And so the anxiety of influence, in the case of Adichie, to plug herself into Achebe, is really interesting because what it does is that it interpolates us as readers. When you pick up that novel and you see things started falling apart, you're like, well, this sounds familiar. But as you read it along, you realize that she's trying to propose something different, that she is of a generation that is built on that, but has its own experiences and its own take on that moment of disillusionment in the 70s, precisely because of the fact that these writers grew up as children at that point in time. I don't know if that makes sense. But I like the question of the question of a generational burden speaks to that. It speaks to the anxiety of influence, but it also speaks to the visibility of many of these writers in the global north, and the question of why they are visible. And I try to address that in the introduction to say that while these writers are selected, they're not necessarily they're not synonymous to the contemporary moment of African writing. But certainly they have been charting a very significant path about how we're going to classify this moment of literary imagination for the continent. And we'll ask ourselves, why is Adichie, why is Binyavanga, why are these writers, of course, why are they visible? And that takes us to the sort of politics of publishing, of who has access to certain platforms of visibility, and what do we leave out? What is left out in that? So I think I'm hoping that addresses that anxiety, and part of why I'm doing the second project on small magazines, if I could speak to that, is that what you begin to see with this third generation of African writers, or this contemporary generation, is that they while they locate themselves in certain primary senses in the West, and they are sort of speaking to audiences in the West, that they are also transferring certain kinds of global capital into the continent. And in the case of Binyavanga, Kwani is a significant organization that he began, and that he was able to transfer the kind of global capital he had into that space into the continent, to be able to give more life to a new generation of African writers. I mean, Kwani has generated a lot of Cain Prize winning writers who have made contemporary African writing visible around the world, who have given people a reason to begin to classify this moment as some sort of renaissance, as important in sort of global literary imagination. So again, there's that notion, that sense that the project doesn't stop with those novels. And if one broadens their focus to see those novels and those memoirs as part of an ecosystem, one begins to see why going back to childhood is important as a sort of capital to invest in this sort of new literary enterprise and this new literary moment. So I'm hoping that sort of speaks to some of your questions, Nduka.
Yeah, sure.
And I know that you wanted to come back on something, but we also have a question from Belinda that I'm hoping we can get to. But perhaps you said you wanted to return to the conversation with a question. Nduka?
Oh, I will let, I just posted a bit of a comment there so that I don't dominate the conversation. Since Belinda is already, so I would keep it on my cards, and then we can get to it later.
Okay, Belinda, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I will unmute and go video to say hello properly. Hi, everybody, and hi, Chris. I really enjoyed that, and I haven't read the book, but it's now on my list of books to get my hands on soon. So I've written my question in the chat, so you can read it there. It's a bit convoluted, but I'm a geographer, and I also do research on migration. And there's something interesting and I think important about diaspora space. So, in your presentation, it might be different to the book, but you speak very much about, Nigerian American, or, Kenya, UK, etc. So kind of a binary notion of diaspora as kind of emigration from one place and immigration to another. But to me, diaspora space, and I think particularly for families who end up with either different members in different countries, or who themselves move from, the US to Canada to the UK or wherever. Diaspora space is something different from just, becoming American or becoming British in a kind of hyphenated way. And I wondered if you explore that more in the book, or if in future work kind of read some of the geographers and others who've written on spatial aspects of diaspora and kind of identity related to that, because might it be?
So you keep breaking up, Belinda, but I think we got your.
Yeah. I think the final chapter of the book tries to grapple with that. I was just using the hyphenated identities because they are the more sort of dominant in certain moments in some of these narratives, like Americana. But in the last chapter of the book, Belinda, I tried to sort of engage with I tried to engage with how these contemporary writers are basically asking us to complicate our understanding of diaspora as a concept that we can genealogize. How do we talk about it? How do we think about this contemporary generation as asking questions around certain dominant frameworks of understanding diaspora? In this case, the Middle Passage. In the case of Helen Oyemi, how do we begin to see, I suppose, sublimated connections between Middle Passage diasporic identities and those of the sort of moment of colonization in the early 20th century, or these moments of sort of post-colonial diasporas? And you can mention a number of writers. I mean, Sefi Atta, who has this fascinating collection of short stories called News from Home, it's really beautifully written, and there are these moments in each of those short stories where you find these immigrants who are either first generation immigrants into a country, either America or in Europe, but then their children, they have a different take on how they identify with the nationality of their parents, but also how they identify with the sort of historical diasporas. So I think that there's a spectrum of understanding diaspora in that final chapter that I am saying childhood allows us to understand the fluidity and the messiness of it, but also the multiple points of reference. And this is why I insist that if you read, say, Helen Oyemi's works, she has a much more complicated sense of what diaspora means as a space of imagination compared to someone like Adichie. What you see with Adichie in many of her short stories, the thing around your neck, or even Americana, is a very sort of presentist, contemporary sense of what diaspora means, which speaks to a particular audience. It speaks to the audience that we know, those of us who live in the continent. Every time we see statistics about government revenue, we hear that the diaspora is contributing a certain amount of money, which is a big chunk of how these GDPs are operating. That's a very specific demographic, and it's the volume of it is increasing by the day. And those are the sort of hyphenated identities we're talking about. And that entire demographic is quite present in the US. I don't know about Canada. And that's why a novel like Americana can really fly. It can find readership and discussion, and but what does it leave out? What does it leave out in terms of the sort of historical diasporas and sort of the political economy of the concept of diaspora? What is it that it leaves out? What is it that it doesn't genealogize that other writers are doing? I mean, Yaa Gyasi's what's Yaa Gyasi's novel?
Transcendent Kingdom.
Homegoing.
Yes.
Homegoing. I find it fascinating in that regard, in the sense that it takes us back to I don't know if people have read that novel. I find it really teachable in the way that it goes back to it doesn't really focus on childhood, but it does genealogize these two siblings, the one who ended up under the governor's castle, into the door of no return, across the Middle Passage, and the other one who stayed behind. And it does this fascinating sort of archaeological thing where it's tracing from the 17th century all the way up to the 21st century. And this is a contemporary writer. So what is she saying? What statement is she? What does she seek to achieve in trying to write this novel? What does she seek to achieve in trying to help us rethink how we understand the concept of diaspora, in how we imagine identities, contemporary African identities. So Belinda, I think that the final chapter goes into those, those blind spots and those it answers your question.
Thank you. I'm going to once again ask you to raise your hand in the chat if you want to ask a question, but Nduka, you may now use that opportunity to pose the question that you couldn't earlier while we wait.
Okay,
I will
so,
try and look out for hands that, yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to point out that with relation to the book itself, that although we may not read direct and sustained focus on how the neoliberal policies of the 1980s and early 1990s contributed to things falling apart and culminated the massive brain drain and migration, one can sense the socioeconomic forces that inspired the novelist's experiences and the handling of their childhood. So I imagine, Chris, that as you wrote this was like a soundtrack, for these writers emerging from that season and in that context. I thought it'd be nice to hear a little bit more on the ways in which you balance what you had to put in to explain the context that produced this kind of writing, either in terms of childhood or memories or nationhood, especially given the centrality of the neoliberal policies and of, especially in the context of Nigerian military dictatorship, shaping these narratives.
Should I respond to that?
Sure.
I think that, ultimately I emerged from a discipline of literary studies. And this is the reason why I'm very afraid of historians like Sarah. But, but I think that each of those novels, they're different. I don't know how to put it. So Half of Elosan is a very historical novel. And I put it in there because it gives me an immediate context. Within the sort of form of the novel that it is, it gives a really interesting context that can allow me to plug in there very specifically. And then you have a novel like The Opposite House, which is quite literary. I don't know how to put it that way. The poetics of it is very literary. And there you have to sort of double with the fact that that it comes after the Icarus Girl. And the Icarus Girl really brings us back to the continent in certain historical ways. And so you have to sort of position each of these novels in a way that can speak directly to moments of contextual history, and in other moments where they historicize, and it's a sort of a logic of historiography. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. Maybe I didn't understand it, but
no, but yes, you are. I'm looking at how either in terms of the immediate writers or their parents, in regard to the migration, the social context for the migration, how this impacted those representation of childhood. In the case of Chimamanda Adichie, for example, even if he didn't quite experience the war, these were based on her immediate research and also of her lived experience, after the war, and how she revisits this. And I thought it was very prescient in terms of the title, because Half of a Yellow Sun is the flag of Biafra. And more than ever before, in fact, it looks like the war is being relived again at this moment with regards to agitations of indigenous peoples of Biafra. So I am, trying to to see how the kind of sifting that you did with regards to what the socioeconomic forces that produce the writing, either that produced the migration directly or indirectly, and how this may have affected, the shaping of the biographies. Sorry, not biographies, not the memoirs. And
actually, just to jump in there, what struck me as really powerful about the book, Chris, is, and so reading it from a social science perspective, what I appreciated was not the overburdening of context and the, so I read it differently than Duka as offering us a way to value the writing and these projects of memory making and multi-directionality without kind of anchoring it too tightly to material circumstance, but that's another set of discussions about reading strategies and writing strategies, I guess. But it struck me as one of the things in your book, Chris, that it really took me out, like beyond that kind of, I guess I use the word of anchor to context, but it's also a dead weight sometimes, that we but whereas what you did was read them as novelists, not as historical chroniclers per se, but so those imaginative capacities that come out in the ways in which you talk about the work that childhood does, doesn't actually have to be a literal dead weight, but it is what is projected onto it. But Deborah Gateskill has a question, so maybe we should open it up a little bit, as we will run out of time. Debbie, go ahead.
Right. Oh, right. I've managed to unmute and I've managed to. That's all been really fascinating, but Chris, I'm sorry, I haven't read the book, so my question comes out of real ignorance. It sounds as though your examples come very much from Nigeria and Kenya, or sort of West and East, but I may be completely wrong. I just wondered, do South Africa and maybe Zimbabwe fall out of consideration for you? Their sort of timings are not quite right with sort of post-coloniality and decolonization and so on. And so do they fall out of your remit on those grounds? I just don't know whether reflections on childhood in South Africa and Zimbabwe come into it, but perhaps your concern is very much to look at the diasporic experience, so maybe that would also limit what was appropriate. So,
no, that's a very important question, and thank you for that. Yeah, certainly the diasporic aspect sort of limits, but also I think in the book I draw on a number of. I draw on Bulawayo, Untitled Bulawayo's We Need New Names, which I think is quite central to understanding childhood, postcolonial identity, I suppose late postcolonial identity in the case of Zimbabwe. But I'm never really sold on the idea that that the post-apartheid moment is new in the sense of sort of postcolonial identity. I'm never sold on that because I know that we can make, and there are people who are currently doing, some of my students who've been trying to make connections between the post-apartheid and the postcolonial as these two sort of interesting dynamics that one can talk about. But I'm never sold on this idea that the post-apartheid is new, because when you look at the sort of archival work that underpins the sort of early moments of modern African literature, and that's the project I'm doing at the moment, that the foundations of modern African literature were very much also infused and invested in anti-apartheid imagination. And if I was to go all historian and chronicler, I would tell you that you have no, it's difficult to talk about Achebe without talking about Eski Mpahlele. It's difficult to talk about modern African literature without talking about some of the work that people like Bloch Mudisane, Louis Nkosi, Nat Nakasa were doing, either with small magazines in the 60s, or some of the work that they did with Transcription Center in London in the 60s. So in essence,
fascinating. I mean, are you saying that those networks are alive across the continent, that African writers and students in West Africa and East Africa are in touch with Mpahlele? And yeah, right.
Well, I mean,
or they meet in England or whatever.
I'm trying to say that the enterprise of modern African literature cannot be seen outside of anti-apartheid imagination, outside of these exile writers moving around the continent, making their own, making really there's a huge footprint, and this is an understatement. There's a really huge footprint of exilic imagination within that moment of decolonization that comes from a sort of an anti-apartheid foundation. And those of us here who are in literary studies will know that the first major conference of African writers of English expression, the money actually eventually discovered the money came from the CIA, but Eskia Mphahlele was a major figure in bringing all of these writers together. And if you look at the early, issues of transition, you see a lot of, Black South African writers writing about that, finding points of solidarity with the continent. So in that regard, I don't see the post-apartheid moment as new in that regard. I think that Black South African intellectual histories or exilic South African intellectual histories have a major part to play in how we understand modern African literature, or that moment of decolonization. There are footprints there. But if I sort of run through and come to this millennial moment, the figure of someone like Binyavanga Wainaina is interesting in that regard, because he came to South Africa in the late 80s, just before the end of apartheid. And when you read his memoir, you begin to see him making those connections that, as someone who comes out of a moment of disillusionment in Kenya and arriving into this moment where there's excitement towards the end of apartheid, there are interesting connections to be made there. And if we open that up to the sort of small magazines that we see in this millennial moment, we see interesting work and networks between Chimurenga and Kwani and other small magazines as a continent that are part of this contemporary moment of African literature that I'm talking about. So there's a whole dynamic of sort of continental diasporas, if I could use it that way, that someone like Binyavanga Wainaina is interesting in that regard. And Yewande Omotoso, who has published a couple of really fascinating novels. I would recommend Yewande Omotoso's work absolutely any day to anyone. She writes beautifully, but when we think of the South Atlantic, we think of someone who's occupying the sort of intersections of Nigerian, Caribbean, and South African identity in the Cape. And so how does that's another different inflection of post-apartheid from the position of the Cape. And the kind of imagination that comes out of those conjunctures is quite fascinating. If you read her novel, the second novel, I forget the name. It's a very popular title that she borrowed from another American novelist. I forget the name. It's about these two sort of octogenarians, a Black woman and a white woman in Constantia, who hate each other with a passion.
Sounds riveting.
But they're really good friends in the sense that they sort of come together because of a crisis of Constantia as a geography of enslavement. And again, Belinda, we can come back to this to talk about. And she offers a really fascinating perspective. So one has to genealogize to be able to see these connections. And there are certain novels that give you that and others that don't. That's why I was saying there are certain novels like Adichie's Hafez San, which locates itself within the broader writing on Biafra. It interpolates us by either creating characters we remember from earlier generations of writing about Biafra, and it's very deliberate. In the epilogue, for instance, where she says, I couldn't have brought this story together without reading, say, Destination Biafra or Buchi Emecheta's, I forget the title of Buchi Emecheta's Biafra novel. So each of these novels, each of these narratives allow us different logics of historicization, if I could speak in that sense. I hope that answers your question. But yeah,
that was fascinating because it sort of undermines any sense of South Africa being cut off. What you're saying is that these writers in exile are not cut off from Africa. That, that was just fascinating.
Thanks, Ari. I'm going to cut in a little bit here. There's some drilling happening outside, but we're almost at the end of our time. I mean, I guess, Chris, I'd love to see your take on white South African writing and childhood and innocence, and of which I think that might look a little different. the sort of the ways in which it you know, why childhood is
and quite
is the
tradition. Yeah.
It's the claim to innocence about the system, right? In a lot of Southern white settler writing, but that would be another whole book. And thank you so much, Chris. It was absolutely, you know, I think you have given us a really good sense of how rich and powerful the book is. And Sarah and Nduka, thank you for expanding that and taking us into the book, because I do think a lot of us have not yet had the opportunity to read it, but I hope that we will. As usual, Femi has wonderfully put the title and the purchasing details into the chat for those of you who would like to order the book, and I certainly will be using it in my teaching, and I hope others find it useful for those purposes too. So Christopher, thank you. Good luck with your next project. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for being part of this series. Femi, you know, the hugest of thanks to you for holding all of this together. Without you, this would be, you know this, I have told you this before, but I want to say it in public that without Femi, and now supported by Deborah Alate, we would not be able to put this series together across the globe in the way that we have. So thank you all. I look forward to seeing you next year. And happy holidays for those of you celebrating.
I just wanted to say, when I began, I didn't really thank you and Femi and Sarah and Duka. I'm very grateful for your time and for this platform. And to the people watching who came over today, I'm really grateful. Thank you for giving me your audience. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.